Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this joint event with the Cambridge Union Society in collaboration with the Cambridge University Law Society. We regret that, sadly, due to a last-minute change in circumstances, we're unable to have Lord Falconer join us in person, but obviously the safety of our members and guests is the first thing we think about before any event, so we're delighted that he can join us via video link. Just in terms of format, what's going to happen is he will give a short address, followed by a few questions from me, and then we will be straight on to audience questions. So feel free to, as he's talking, start jotting down some questions. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce the Shadow Attorney General, Lord Falconer.
Joel, thank you very much indeed. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person. I was more concerned about your safety than mine, on the basis that there'd been more than 6 people in a room, and me coming from Parliament, where people are coming the whole time in and out, and there've been various outbreaks there. I thought the safest thing would not be to come, and I deeply, deeply regret not coming. But I'm very glad that I can do it in Zoom. I mean, could I briefly say a few remarks about where I think politically the country is at the moment, and then, as Joel has said, let's have a discussion about what you think. 2020, I don't think turned out politically like anybody expected it to turn out. We Labour were beaten hollow in 2019. We were effectively beaten on the basis that the country had got fed up with the political stalemate that had followed Brexit. And Boris Johnson had quite skillfully shot off those bits of his party that didn't support a clean break Brexit as quickly as possible. So he looked like he had a very, very clear position. And 2020 looked like it was going to be all about how the Conservative Party transmogrified itself into a party that was both the home counties and the red wall seats in the Midlands and the Northwest and the Northeast of England. Now, you all know it didn't turn out that way because the virus came along. But it's impossible not to view how politics is going now in the context of the virus without thinking where the Conservatives have got to at the point the virus struck. And I think there are 3 particular things about the government which are really important. First of all, they don't believe that the normal things that determine how well or how badly you do as a government really matter. They think the really important thing is the strategic direction that you're following. So there was a whole series of messes politically that would normally have been thought to be hugely damaging to a government. The most striking of those in the build-up to the 2019 election being the prorogation case, where the government had tried in effect to break away from Parliament and close Parliament down whilst they went through the end game of the Brexit negotiations, and the Supreme Court dragged them back to Parliament. They came back to Parliament, and when everybody got back to Parliament, it was just more of the same. Under normal times, that would have been incredibly damaging to the government. In the times that we were in, building up to 2019 election, that I think simply fed the view that Parliament was pretty hopeless at solving the country's problems. It didn't weaken the government at all, it strengthened the government. The second thing about the government is it's absolutely as determined as it possibly can be to break away from the normal checks and balances. And I mean, there are normally 4 checks and balances on a government. First of all, Parliament, And what this government, with a majority of 78 or 80, is doing is it's trying to be as little accountable to Parliament as possible. That's exhibited in a presidential strategy by the Prime Minister in terms of addressing the nation, the press conferences and the television addresses. Secondly, an approach whereby instead of legislating in the normal way, where you set out in legislation what you think are the important points and ask Parliament to agree them or not, they're repeatedly legislating in the form of a bill that says the minister shall have power by regulations to set out what the policy in this particular area is. And you can see that in the agriculture bill, the trade bill, the immigration bill, the private international law bill. So the more you give ministers that power, the less you've got to come to Parliament in order to get approval for particular things. Thirdly, they're completely uninterested in the quality of parliamentary performance in determining who should be senior ministers. They are only concerned with loyalty. So, and this is not a party political point, but I think there will be a widespread agreement that it is hard to imagine a more inept seeming education secretary than Mr. Gavin Williamson, who I'm sure is a perfectly nice fellow in his private life. He has presided over a number of catastrophes for which he is responsible, most particularly the A-level result fiasco, and yet they are completely indifferent to his continuation in office because they take the view that it doesn't matter. And then the fourth way that Parliament plays very little part in what they do is they completely ignore the whole time what the Lords does. Now that's the most insignificant of the four things, because the Lords is very, very illegitimate by comparison with the Commons, but there is no attempt by them to, as it were, respond to Parliament. So they're not interested in the check and balance of Parliament. In relation to the media, they've got some supportive right-wing newspapers. The area of danger for them is in relation to, in particular, the BBC, and they're seeking to appoint a favourable chair to the BBC with a view to sending a message that if the BBC is not careful, there will be difficulties for the BBC. And their particular focus in relation to that is on the licence fee. The third check and balance is the civil service, who are a very substantial check and balance normally, in the sense that they are bound by a code. You can't do particular things if you are a government unless you can get the civil service to agree that it's proper. And they fired 6 permanent secretaries, including the head of the Foreign Office, the head of the cabinet secretary, the head of the whole shooting match, and the chief lawyer, the Treasury solicitor. And that has a very, very chilling effect on the civil service and the way that they will give advice to the government. And then the fourth check and balance is the law. And the judges are the enemy of the people. The lawyers are all a bunch of lefty lawyers who are simply trying to frustrate what they do. And they're currently consulting about whether or not judicial review, which is the main way the law holds the government to account, should be restricted. So they came to power with a huge majority at the beginning of 2020 with a Trumpian view that you've just got to ignore the checks and balances and absolutely go for broke. And then the virus struck. And the virus struck in a way where what you most needed was a government that concentrated on detail, that looked competent, and was able to bring the country along with it. And I think the country has been incredibly keen to trust the government, because it's a terrible thing that has happened. The virus is having a huge and incredibly damaging effect on people's lives, and there is no real end in sight in relation to it. And the way that people's lives are being affected is sort of unimaginable last year. The effect on people's educational prospects because of the A-level fiasco, with people not getting the A-levels that they could reasonably have expected they would get, then followed by not getting into university, then the changes, then getting into a particular university. And the idea that the government could have allowed that to happen is absolutely extraordinary. The persistent changes in the rules that apply to lockdown, and the sense now that it's going to last over the winter. It was bad enough for quite a lot of people during the last 6 months of the lockdown. I think people are feeling quite despairing in relation to it. And this is all in the context of a government that the way it behaves doesn't necessarily engender trust. And that's not just about Dominic Cummings and the eye test trip to Castle Barnard. It's not just about the Attorney General who's there to protect the law, who sides with a lawbreaker like Dominic Cummings. It's not just about the bill that has just started in the Lords today, the internal market bill, which is basically saying that the government will break the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is the basis upon which it was possible for us to leave the European Union, on the basis that we would do checks on goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, so that the European Union could be confident that there being no border on the island of Ireland wouldn't mean that non-conforming goods would come into the single market, that there wouldn't be a great hole in the integrity of the single market. And they just announced, as you know, well, they not just announced, 6 weeks ago, they announced that they were going to break the terms of the protocol if they couldn't get satisfaction in the negotiations that they're doing. They, the Conservatives, and this is a fundamental shift in politics, believe that they have got a coalition of traditional Conservative voters plus the Red Wall, which will beat Labour's coalition, which is increasingly a coalition made up of young people, BAME communities, and certain big metropolitan areas and university towns. And they believe that we won't be able to break out of that electoral coalition, and that electoral coalition is not big enough for us to win back power. I think that they are wrong about that. I think that they are wrong about that because ultimately this country at particular moments will move in a moderately universal way. No party will ever get more than 50%, but the degree of shifts in support that occur at major crossroads, 1945, 1964, 1997, and 2019, occur because the country makes a decision about which direction it wants to go. We've suddenly been tipped into this area where you have to look at your government and make a decision not just about whether it's competent, and obviously everybody can form a view about whether or not this particular government is competent, and there are obviously signs that it is not, but also what is the direction that you want the country to take. It looked like in 2019 the country had made a very clear choice about the direction it wanted to go in. And if you'd asked me, I would have thought it would be very difficult for us to dislodge the Conservatives at the 2024 election. Now it feels completely open as to what will happen. And what will determine the result of the next general election is competence, but also which of the two big political parties does the public think is primarily on their side in a meaningful way. And the debate that's taking place at the moment between Manchester and the government is incredibly indicative of a government that is losing the trust of great swathes of the people. The Northwest, Lancashire, Manchester, Liverpool, lots of it is quite Labour, but quite a lot of it as well either went Tory during the 2019 election, having previously been Labour, or is on the edge of going Tory. And Andy Burnham has kept the whole of that coalition together in Greater Manchester, not Liverpool and not Lancashire, but in Greater Manchester, in favour, in effect, of standing out against the government, when all the pressure as a politician at the moment is to take a cooperative view, because everybody is aware that the public wants the politicians to try to cooperate and come to a particular conclusion. I think we're moving into an area where a very, very big series of choices are going to have to be made about the economy. And the Conservative government looks like it is moving towards a position. We've kept the economy alive. You've now only got to save, quote, viable jobs. And as long as we save viable jobs, and viable jobs means where there is still work and pay for the person, they will get paid. But for everybody else, you're going to have to depend upon universal credit and 66% support if you earn 30,000 quid or less. And the way that Rishi Sunak is talking, the way that the Conservative, the group in Parliament is talking, is, well, all this has got to be paid for at some point, so we're going to have to go back to a sort of austerity position. And then the alternative view, which I think is the view probably that the Governor of the Bank of England holds, and the IMF holds, and the World Bank holds, and Gordon Brown holds, is that you have to invest heavily now to keep the country going. You've got to make it clear that the government ultimately is the provider of last resort in a situation like this. And the way that you provide at the end of the day is by giving support to ensure jobs are preserved. You raise the money in effect by deficit spending. The Bank of England is able to buy government debt, and by buying government debt, which is effectively an electronic transfer, even though you increase the deficit that the country has at that particular point, you have to do it in order to keep the economy going, even though that puts levels of debt as a ratio of your GDP at much higher levels than it's been for 50 or 60 years. Ultimately, that is what is necessary to keep the country going and to give people proper opportunities. There's going to come a big choice in relation to that. And I think the person who wins the next general election is the person who is on the right side of that particular choice. So politics have changed, like politics changed in the United States of America. I don't know what's going to happen in the United States of America. I felt before the virus struck that it was more likely than not that Trump would win because he hadn't lost his base. But the coronavirus has changed everything and made people's attitude towards government look very, very different. Ultimately, government has to take care and provide security for the public, economically and in a public health sense. And I think Trump has very much failed in relation to that. I don't know what the result will be, but I'm now more optimistic that Biden will win in America. And I think in the UK, it's the same question. It's not just about competence, though they're incompetent. It's also about what's the nature of the government that you want. Is it one that ultimately says, let the markets ultimately control things? Or is it one that ultimately accepts the security of the nation, public health, and the economy is what the government's got to provide? And that ultimately is what a left of centre government is better at providing than a right of centre one. And that will be the big choice that's coming in 4 years. Joel, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you for that very wide-ranging diagnosis of the problems that face, in particular, our institutions of state. I think what would be very interesting is to hear what you think the Shadow Cabinet, of which you are a member, can do. The next election is some years off. How can the Shadow Cabinet in particular, but also the Parliamentary Party and supporters across the country, prevent some of the encroachment that we've seen with the BBC, with the courts of law, and with other institutions of state, such as the civil service?
In relation to the individual encroachments on the checks and balances, it is absolutely critical that what the opposition does, the Shadow Cabinet and Keir Starmer, is repeatedly argue and use our platform to make it clear what's happening in the country, the way that things are changing in relation to the way that the Constitution is run. Ultimately, that is really important, and you will make headway, much more headway than the extent to which because there are only 202 Labour MPs in the Commons at the moment, 2 of whom are either the Speaker or the Deputy Speaker. So there are 200 elected representatives of Labour, and there are 628 other members, or 628 members of Parliament, apart from the speakers. There are 400 others. But Labour is the biggest opposition party, and it is for us repeatedly to draw attention to the encroachments that are going on. So I think we've got to use our platform to make it clear what's happening. But secondly and separately, I think the key thing that the Shadow Cabinet and the Labour representation in Parliament have got to do is to identify what is the direction of travel. Is the position that what is required is a very big commitment to government expenditure to keep the country going during the period of restriction caused by a pandemic, and thereafter a big investment in order to put the country back on its feet and build back better? And it's those big choices which the Shadow Cabinet and the Parliamentary Party's got to make that will determine what happens to the country. Much more than people think.
And just one more question before we open it up to the floor. In terms of the legal world and the criminal bar of which you are still a member, I was just wondering what your message would be to the people who Priti Patel might term activist lawyers, people fighting the changes to judicial review, or who are suffering the continued cuts to legal aid. How do you think the legal world should respond to this government's approach?
I mean, there has never, ever been a time where public lawyers, publicly funded lawyers, both giving welfare advice, representing people charged with criminal offences, and people giving advice in relation to relationship breakdown and the fate of children. There's never, ever, ever been a time when they have been more under pressure from clients and the need to represent the people they represent. It is beyond imagination that one has a government that curls its lip at these lawyers and treats them as if they are the enemy of the country. It is shameful. It means that these people who are lawyers are heroic figures because they're being treated by the government as if they're politically aligned, when 99% of them are not politically aligned at all. But I can tell you, if the government go on behaving like they are, then lots and lots and lots of those lawyers who are either not politically aligned at all or are conservative leaning will find that they absolutely repudiate and reject the Conservative Party. My advice to them would be to keep on going. A time will come when it will be the government who will be realised to be in the wrong, not the lawyers.
Great, let's open it up to the floor for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hands. Don't be shy. Yes, the person right at the back over there.
Thank you. I was interested in your thoughts about the American election. I heard you saying that you're more optimistic Biden can win, but I'm curious from a Labour perspective, what you think either both a Biden victory would mean for the bilateral relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, and also what a Trump re-election would mean for the bilateral relationship between the United States and the UK. Thank you.
Well, I think this is there's a Labour perspective, and the Labour perspective is that the Democrats are more our sister party than the Republicans. So we in Labour would have an easier relationship with the president than we have with the Republicans. There is also, as far as the government is concerned, a massive cultural gulf between the Trump administration and the British government. I mean, even though Boris Johnson shares many of Trump's, as it were, political gambits, ultimately the way that Trump is he's contemptuous of alliances. He is make America great again, and he is so focused on using foreign countries as a means of promoting his own domestic agenda that the relationship of any government with the Trump administration is very difficult. I think that Biden has a much, much greater sense, a more normal sense of the importance to America of alliances. The way the world is going to be in the future, America can't just shrink into itself and treat practically everybody else with a mixture of contempt and unreliability. So I think the bilateral relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States of America will become easier with a president more connected with the idea of bilateral relationships. But even if it is President Biden, I think the approach of the United States of America to Europe and to the wider world is much more isolationist now than it was under President Obama. And even though the ability to talk to each other will become very much easier under President Biden, if he becomes the president, I think we've got to recognize that Trump's election wasn't just a freak. It represented a quite significant move to an isolationist position of the United States of America.
Yeah, the person on this side, in the back. Yeah, in the black.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here in spirit, if not in person. My question is that in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's ruling on the prorogation case, Boris Johnson seemed to suggest a desire to clip the wings of the judiciary. Do you believe that this is possible, and is there any real risk of this occurring, given recent events? Thank you.
Yeah, I do think there's a significant risk of it occurring, and I think it can occur in two separate ways. First of all, I think that Johnson will try and reduce the ability of the courts to intervene by judicial review, and I think he'll do it in three particular ways. First, he will reduce the number of organizations that can bring judicial review cases. So currently, for example, NGOs and pressure groups can bring judicial reviews, and I think he will try and limit a judicial review to an actual individual affected by a government decision. Secondly, I think that he will introduce some statute that says the courts can't intervene in inverted commas political cases, with a view to trying to prevent anything like the prorogation case ever occurring again. And thirdly, I think he will try and introduce a law that says even if the court finds that something is unlawful, nevertheless they don't have to give a remedy if they think giving a remedy was contrary to government policy, so that politics becomes prime over the law. And I think that would be an absolutely terrible thing to happen. So I think procedural changes to judicial review is one way he's going to do it. And the other is if you really go at the judges politically, as Boris Johnson has done and the Conservative Party has done, and made it clear that they are in play politically as part of the metropolitan Remainer elite, which is broadly the pitch that the government uses to attack the judges, you will find the judges who are brave, very aware of the law and its importance, very aware of the importance of the rule of law, very independent-minded. Nevertheless, they will become much more aware of what the impact of their individual decisions are going to be. They'll be asking themselves, is this decision I'm about to make one that's going to inflame the culture war between the judges on the one hand and the government on the other? So by the incessant attacks that the government runs on the judges and by those three procedural devices that I've indicated, I think the government will clip the wings of the judges, to use your language. And then, I mean, I think they won't do this, but the last measure they could try to use would be to have some sort of hearing in Parliament before somebody was appointed to be a Supreme Court justice. And although it would never get as bad as the states, once the judges realised that if you had to get to the Supreme Court, you had to go through a hearing before the politicians, that would have a quite significant impact, I think, on the way that the judges were.
Do we have... Yes, over there.
Are you concerned by the way the government is essentially managing the COVID-19 crisis under statutory instrument and thus avoiding parliamentary scrutiny?
Yes, I am. I'm very, very, very concerned about it. They passed an act at the beginning of the crisis, the Coronavirus Act 2020, which gave them quite limited and quite sensible powers. In fact, almost all of the provisions that they are introducing now have been introduced under the Public Health Act 1984. That act contains a provision that says a minister can produce regulations which have to be approved by Parliament to combat a public health emergency. And it's as broad as that. There is, in addition, a provision in the Public Health Act to the effect that if there is an emergency which requires immediate regulations, the minister can certify the emergency, introduce the regulations, and then doesn't need parliamentary approval for a particular period of time. What has been happening over the last 6 months is that the Public Health Act has been used. They're all being done with Matt Hancock certifying that there is an emergency. There is an emergency, but that's not the same, I think, as an emergency so severe that you've got to introduce regulations without going through a proper process. By the time the time is reached whereby these regulations have to be approved by Parliament, there are new regulations in force. So the old regulations are pushed to one side, new regulations are introduced which then control the position, and they're very, very rarely approved by Parliament. So it's a sort of extraordinary moment today when I don't know how, I mean, it's ending now in the Prime Minister's giving a press conference at the moment saying how the Manchester row is ending. But it is probably going to end with the people of Manchester being locked down in tier 3 restrictions, with all the financial, emotional, educational, cultural and social consequences that brings, which are very, very far reaching. There won't be any debate in Parliament about it because it will be done by emergency regulations. Andy, in the press conference he gave about 20 minutes ago on the steps of Manchester Town Hall, appealed to Parliament to do something about it. For example, ensure that if there are going to be these regulations, please make sure that I get sufficient help for the poorest people in Manchester. Parliament, in the face of these huge intrusions, is powerless to act. There might be a debate next week in relation to them, but by then the deed will have been done. So yes, I am incredibly concerned about what is happening. I am conscious that my concerns as a parliamentarian and as a constitutional lawyer are probably not shared widely amongst the public, because I think most people are not interested in the detail of that, and most people have rather lost confidence in Parliament because of the very prolonged failure to produce a solution to the Brexit issue until the general election of 2019. And how we end up coming out of this crisis will depend to quite a significant extent about what economic decisions are taken, but most of those decisions won't be put through Parliament. I mean, the other bit of this is Scotland and what's going to happen to Scotland constitutionally. We've ended up, because of the virus, Scotland being even more identifiable as a separate kingdom. That strengthened the hand, I think, of the SNP, which is strengthened yet further by the culturally unappealing nature of the Prime Minister in Scotland. What is the constitutional way forward in relation to Scotland? What is the constitutional way forward in relation to the fact that we're being governed by decree at the moment? I don't know, but it may well be that what we need is a massive constitutional convention to rewrite our constitution.
Yeah, the person in the back row over there.
As a Manchester native, I found your last comment quite interesting, because cases in Manchester over the last few days have actually been falling, I think since about the weekend. So with that in mind, could Matt Hancock's argument that there is an emergency in Manchester actually hold up to scrutiny when the lockdown could be seen as not necessary if cases are actually falling?
Well, I'm interested in that because I think it's unclear to me what the precise public health position in Manchester is. The government are relying particularly on the ICU figures, i.e. the extent to which the ICU departments in Manchester are either close to full or full. And they've relied upon, this is the government, number 10 Downing Street, have relied upon the ICU figures for 4 out of the 7 hospital trusts in Manchester. And they range from being 80% to 100% full. There's a Nightingale Hospital in Manchester, and there are 3 other hospital trusts. The director of health, the NHS in Manchester, has said, I don't think that the ICUs are going to be overwhelmed imminently. A government minister was on the telly and the radio this morning saying, if you don't agree to tier 3, then the ICUs will be overwhelmed by the 8th of November, which is extremely unlikely. Or put it another way, if they're going to be overwhelmed by the 8th of November, there's absolutely nothing that the lockdown is going to do about it, because the people who are going to go into ICU on by the 8th of November have all already been infected. So it's not going to make any difference. So the stuff that the government is relying on looks unreliable, though it does look like Manchester is in a pretty high bracket in relation to it. Because there isn't proper parliamentary scrutiny, all this detail is not being properly examined. The government isn't having to make available all of this material, so these massive decisions can't be looked at. I think Andy Burnham thinks that maybe you do need to go into something like Tier 3, and he's open to the suggestion that if the proper information was provided, that might be the position. But he's very, very strong on saying when London was in lockdown, more than Tier 3, but it was in lockdown, everybody got 80%. Now that it's Manchester, it's only going to be 66 2/3%, which is going to be an incredibly divisive feeling for the country over the winter, I think.
Yes, straight in front. Thanks.
Hello, I'm interested in your thoughts on the internal market bill. Specifically, it's a very complex issue, and what would you do and your party do if you're in government to resolve it?
Well, there are two bits to the internal market bill that are significant. First of all, there is what do you do about the fact that you must have a completely open trading market within the United Kingdom, and power has been devolved to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland so they can impose different regulatory requirements on goods that travel and move between the four kingdoms, where they can all do it: Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Before the European Union set the standard and it applied to everybody, so it wasn't a problem while we were in the European Union. Before we were in the European Union, you could have different standards applying in Northern Ireland, Scotland and England, and it wasn't a problem. The reason it wasn't a problem was, and there were much less separate regulations in those days, was because by and large the three constituent parts that had different legal frameworks would always agree on goods that travelled between the countries as to what the standards were. So in relation to the internal market, what I would do would be to rely on something called the Common Frameworks Arrangement, which in every sector tries to agree what the standards are. Those standards should be legally binding in the sense that if the Common Frameworks process for a particular sector agrees what the standards are, then they apply everywhere. If agreement can't be reached, then the Westminster Parliament can determine what it is. But you will find in most cases that there is agreement in relation to it. That's one bit of the bill. The other bit of the bill is trying to deal with the Northern Irish Protocol. And I mean, this is an absolute scandal on the part of the government. The internal market bill says that the government can break the Northern Irish Protocol. The purpose of the Northern Irish Protocol, as I said at the beginning, was to ensure that goods in and coming into Northern Ireland would be compliant with the single market's regulations. Once they were compliant with the single market regulations, you didn't need a closed border. That was the essence of the deal that was done. The Brexiteers, the ERG, didn't like that deal at all because it kept the single market in the north of Ireland, and it also led to there having to be checks for some goods going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. The government has taken power in the internal market bill to break the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol in a number of specific respects. It's a terrible thing for the United Kingdom to do. The United Kingdom goes around the world saying we want a rules-based world. We don't want might to be right. We don't want people who abuse human rights. And our economic strength depends upon being a country that you can trust to stand by its agreements. And basically, just to get a good headline and just to make it appear that Boris Johnson is being tough, he's trashed our reputation as a law-abiding country for next to no gain at all, because the areas of disagreement in the discussions that are going on about the operation of the Northern Ireland Protocol are, first, should people who take goods out of Northern Ireland to Great Britain have to make an exit declaration, which is a short summary of the goods that are going. Well, I'm in favour of trying to reduce unnecessary paperwork, but that's not the stuff of law breaking. And then the second issue is whether or not, in relation to the state aids regime, that's the subsidies that governments provide to their own countries, what is the precise delineation of the state aids that Britain have agreed to sign up to? Does it include only state aids that predominantly affect Northern Ireland, or can it include state aids that peripherally affect Northern Ireland? And that's the most interesting legal point, but it's got practically no significance in practical terms. So what the government have done is trashed our reputation as a law-abiding country simply in order to look tough against the European Union for domestic political reasons. And they don't know what they're costing the country by doing that. Or maybe they do, but they don't care.
Did you have a question? Yeah.
There's a very long and protracted history in this country of attempting to get assisted suicide legislation passed, including your bill in 2014 that was unsuccessful. Given that we now have so many other examples of countries who have been able to introduce safe and compassionate legislation, and that the most recent public opinion polls seem to demonstrate overwhelming support, what's it going to take for such legislation to be passed in this country?
Well, I'm very, very strongly in favour of legislation to allow people, if they're dying and have got less than 6 months to live, to take their own life supervised by a doctor. I mean, you say the most recent opinion polling is strongly in favour of it. It's in favour of it by margins of over 70%, but it's not just recent opinion pollings. That's been the position for the last 10 years and more. So it's the sort of settled opinion of the public that they want this change in the law. The House of Lords has in effect voted for a bill to do that. The blockage is the miserable cowardice of the House of Commons, repeatedly revealed over the last 10 years. They persistently vote against it. They vote against it, I believe, because most of the MPs, quite understandably, aren't particularly engaged with the issue. But they find that the loudest voice in their constituency against it tends to be organised religion. They don't want to upset organised religion by being in favour of assisted dying. So this really critical liberal reform that is so necessary and so many people want just never takes place because the House of Commons is too unfocused and too unwilling to do the right thing. And they are probably the only group in the United Kingdom of significance that is against it. No, that's wrong, actually. The Church of England is against it, and the Catholic Church is against it.
Hello, thank you. So your talk was very interesting, but broadening out the conversation a bit to what Labour could look like if it were to win, what's Keir Starmer's and the Labour Party's sort of idea of having a sort of an election-winning majority, and what would be the place for Scotland, which historically has been a large sort of supporter of Labour and a large provider of Labour seats in that sort of new coalition? Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear the question. You couldn't repeat the question, could you?
Sure. So essentially, what would Labour's sort of winning coalition be in the next election? And particularly, what would Scotland's role be in it, seeing Scotland's sort of historically important role in sort of supporting Labour? Thank you.
In order to win the next election, Labour has got to retain its metropolitan seats, and it's got to extend its reach into the red wall seats, and it's got to not necessarily win a majority of seats in Scotland, but it's got to make progress in relation to winning at least a third of the seats in Scotland. And those were seats that it has lost to the SNP. How does it do that? Well, as I said earlier on, seismic shifts occur in politics in the United Kingdom, as they did in 45, 64, 97 and 19. Seismic shifts occur when people believe that the mood of the country is most represented by a strand of thought represented by one of the two major parties. And if we represent a strand of thought that ultimately reflects how the country wants to go economically, then we can win. And we can win back our red wall seats on the basis that the Tories are just as bad as people thought they were. In Scotland, we have got a very, very big mountain to climb in Scotland. And I think the only way that we make progress in Scotland is by ultimately people believing in Scotland that by voting Labour, there is a chance of there being a Labour government in the United Kingdom, because Scotland would so benefit from a Labour government in Scotland. As long as the Scots feel there is no realistic prospect of a Labour government in Westminster, they can see no point in voting Labour.
In the corner over there. Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering, how likely do you think it is that the current Tory party will last to full term and the next general election will be in 2024? Or do you think that no confidence vote will happen in the next few years and there'll be a general election? Thank you.
Well, I think it is more likely than not that the Tories will last until 2024 because they have a majority of 78 or 80. There is no prospect that they're going to be defeated in Parliament, I don't think. Are they going to fall apart? I mean, they haven't fallen apart for almost 200 years, so I think it's incredibly unlikely that they will fall apart. There are massive cultural tensions within the Tory party at the moment. The red wall seats represent one strand of opinion. The home counties would represent another. Boris doesn't feel like a Tory. He feels like Boris Johnson, and it may be that he can hold those two strands together. But if the tensions become overwhelming, the consequence is not that the Tories will give up power. The consequence is they'll give up Boris Johnson and they'll elect a new leader. So what do I think the chances of the Tories not lasting until 2024 are? Very, very slim indeed. I think they will last until 2024.
Do we have another question? Yeah, over there.
So I'm curious about your strategic approach to opposition governance and whether at this moment, when you're thinking about holding the current government to account and moving the country forward in a better direction, you look to any international models of effective opposition governance or historical models that kind of inspire the work that you're doing today. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think within our own country historically, I think that the most inspirational means of being an effective opposition is you've got to be able to do two things. One, you have really got to do the work about identifying what detailed changes the country needs to make it a better place. You've then, having done that detailed work, you've got to be able to popularize it, because detailed policy is not what necessarily changes people's view about who should be the government. It is your ability as an opposition to catch a mood. And I mean, by the time you get to 1945, even though the government, a national government led by Conservative Winston Churchill, an enormously popular war leader, couldn't hold on, because ultimately, over years, Labour had developed, partly through Beveridge, who's a Liberal, a plan for the future. Again, in '64, the government had developed a detailed plan for how the country should look in the future, and again in '97. So you need to do the work which indicates what the change in direction should be. And secondly, and separately, you've got to be persistently attacking the government to identify what its shortcomings are and to identify what the dividing lines are. And again, in 1945, the big dividing line was that things would not change for a country that had sacrificed for 6 years unless you voted Labour. In 1997, people were absolutely fed up with a decaying public service and a broken and sleazy Conservative government. So I see the biggest models of effective opposition as being from our own history in Labour. I mean, the there are, one looks across the Atlantic and sees inspirational change delivered, for example, by President Kennedy in the election that beat the Republicans in 1960 by a progressive vision of the future, with a Republican government that wasn't particularly played out at that particular time. But ultimately, you need detail, you need vision, you need values, and you need a really, really clear reason why the government shouldn't continue.
Lord Falconer, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. On behalf of the Cambridge University Law Society and the Cambridge Union, I want to thank you for your time today. I think most of us in this room are in Cambridge for another 2 or 3 years, and I'm sure in that time we will get to invite you over again, and hopefully then we can all meet in person. Thank you very much and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.